Hi, Nikki.
Hi, Philip.
Welcome. So tell us a little bit about yourself and the role that you currently have.
Okay, I'll start off with some of my career trajectory and what got me to be where I am today. So I became a nurse in 1994. So I've been a nurse for quite some time. So I became a registered adult nurse. Worked in orthopaedics and trauma for 5 years, focusing on spinal injuries particularly. I then moved into community nursing practice, where I did my specialist district nurse practitioner qualification, which is an additional qualification to your nursing registration. So you do another degree level course. So I became a district nurse. At that point, the primary care trust who I worked with were looking at setting up a diabetes nursing service. And my manager at the time said, do you fancy doing that? I said, well, I've been a general practice nurse. So, my background was I did do some diabetes for them. And he said, well, yeah, apply for it. And then I became one of the first primary care diabetes specialist nurses in Lincolnshire, looking after the southwest of Lincolnshire, so Grantham and Bourne and that area. From then, so I spent 2 or 3 years in that particular role. There was a role came at Nottingham University, which was a practitioner lecturer role. So that particular role was around still being in practice, but also being able to look at curricula and deliver a specialist diabetes nursing programme, and to look at how we can enhance that through contemporary reflection on practice and in practice. And I got that particular role, so I did that for a year, and then a permanent senior lecturer role came up at Nottingham, so I applied for that. So I was at Nottingham until 2013, when we moved over to Lincoln because Nottingham gave up the nursing contract. From that point on, I was the programme lead for nursing at University of Lincoln, and then came to BGU in 2017. And I am now the head of health and social care, head of health and social care programmes here at BGU. So we currently offer a BSc Honours with foundation year, a BSc Honours straight through 3 years, and an MA in health and social care leadership. I teach on all three. I look after all three, and I also work or I'm the link tutor for Icon College and Grantham College. So I have jurisdiction over all those programmes, and I have 2 superb members of my team who support me.
So going back to you moving from like the health sector into education, how did you find that transition between being a healthcare practitioner into being an educator?
Yeah, it was an interesting transition because, nursing has always had a very solid educational background, particularly around continuous professional development. And one of the sort of philosophies around my role was to enable nurses in practice to be able to help and support people with diabetes. So part of that role was about upskilling. So rather than me going into practice and taking over case management of the patients themselves, it was about going in and working with general practices, general practice nurses, district nurses around, we would do sort of peer consultations where we would do them together, and we would they would learn in terms of their knowledge around diabetes management. So I always said that role was almost trying to make yourself unemployable because people had been upskilled through that knowledge and that skill set. That then led me into working with Diabetes UK, which I haven't mentioned, but it's probably timely now. So I was part of a task and finish group with Diabetes UK. And part of that task and finish group, there was podiatrists, consultants, GPs. The head of the group was actually a professor of endocrinology at Addenbrooke's, Professor David Simmons, and we were tasked by Diabetes UK to look at healthcare professional education in terms of the quality of that particular education. So that was back in 2007, I would think. We first published in 2011 because we did a scoping activity where we found that the actual education for healthcare professionals, whether you be a nurse or a consultant or a podiatrist, was actually at best ad hoc. There was no quality, there was no standards. You know, one of the questions that Professor David Simmons said to the group, the challenge was, you know, if you're a patient with diabetes, how do you know that person in front of you actually has got the you know, the qualifications, the competency in order to manage your diabetes? So that was sort of the mission statement in terms of going out there and looking at what activities were. So there were a few higher education courses, but nothing consistently that people could access.
Okay, so I'm interested in your approach to teaching. Okay, and also how practitioners working in education can learn from like, you know, the social care sector, basically. And so the first thing I thought I would ask you, you know, as part of this conversation is, how would you describe your approach to teaching on the health and social care program at BGU?
Okay, so our approach is eclectic. It's very mixed. Our students are very diverse in terms of the health and social care students. So one of my more senior students who graduated a few years ago was way over the age of 60. We have youngsters coming in straight from school. So we have to be very mindful of reading the classroom when we walk in. You know, one size doesn't fit all. And I think one of the skills that maybe we have as a team, because we've all been clinicians in our own right, is about reading the room in terms of, you know, keeping your finger on that proverbial pulse and making sure that the sessions that you're delivering meets everybody's needs, and that can be a challenge. And also in terms of students, for us, it's about some who've got really vast practical experience that we can draw on and learn from, and others that have got very limited experience. So we try and get trying to sort of marry the two and come up with something that actually is enriching for everybody. It's about sharing stories. We do quite a lot of we maybe do, you know, little bits of lecture type sort of delivery, but we do a lot of scenario work, particularly case studies. We try and get students to do a lot of critical reflection. Critical reflection is key across the whole programme in terms of students being critically reflective, not only of their own practice, but also of their own academic practice, but of each other as well, but in a positive way. You know, so when we talk about critical reflection, we're talking about some of there can be negativity around critical reflection, but also the positivity around that. So, okay, so this happened. So what can we do now to make things better? And what have you learned from that? And that sort of reflects is a good word, isn't it? But we use a lot of models of reflection, get students to actually create their own model of reflection in terms of their practice.
So what does planning for your sessions look like? As in, what I'm interested in really is whether you already kind of go into your classroom knowing that there are different possibilities and what you would do differently if certain things were to happen, or are you usually, you know, one of those people that would take an approach where you would react to whatever is happening, where it's more like a reflection in action, rather than like kind of, you know, plan for 100 scenarios ahead of the session?
It depends on what the topic is, because if you're doing a topic that's very sort of, I mean, I tend to teach some of the law and ethics. Well, I do teach the law and ethics module. So some of that's quite dry. So it's about trying to get students to think about those sort of concepts in a very diverse way. So by using case studies. I always say, if I don't get to the end of the session, that's not a bad thing. I think that's something because the conversation has led us down a different trajectory. Because, you know, you might have, you know, some people are sort of very keen to do a lot of PowerPoint work, and I can tell by our students that, you know, a couple of slides in and they're ready to actually tell you about their stories and, you know, sort of engage with what you're doing. We do have a framework, and obviously we have learning objectives which try and give some kind of perspective in terms of students knowing what they're going to expect. But a lot of it is around let's see what the students tell us as part of the journey. So it's sort of an educational journey in class. We do use the VLE quite a lot in terms of getting students to do some pre-work and pre-thinking around the topic area we might be looking at. You know, what does this mean for you in terms of your practice. And if you haven't had experience in practice, think about what it might mean if you experience this in practice. So there's some preparatory work, and also there's always a consolidatory session, on Blackboard that they can sort of look at and reflect on.
What do you do to make sure that your sessions can cater for all the different needs that you recognise, without making it difficult to, for certain groups of students who, for example, if you have somebody who needs you to do something in a particular way, but then other students, it may not be their preference. So how do you overcome that challenge?
Okay, I think it's having that sort of, dare I use the word, intuitive practice element, knowing that, when you see students starting to maybe disengage with what's going on. I know certainly the whole of the team, if we've got a student who has a particular issue, and they look like they're not benefiting from it, and we do tend to take them aside and talk to them later and see, are you okay? Did you understand? Do you want to come back and talk about that? Was it something that you felt uncomfortable with? And we always have the ground rule in class that if we talk about something particularly emotive, as you can imagine some of our subject areas are, that students have permission to go and to leave, but they must always come back and talk to us about what that is so we can debrief. Very important that we have that sort of closure in terms of any of the emotive things we might talk about.
So why do you have this approach? Because I suppose the reason for me asking that is because in higher education, sometimes, rightly or wrongly, you do get some people approaching this as this is the lecture, and your job as a student would be to attend and engage, and because you're meant to be independent, then we wouldn't have to kind of cater for your individual needs as much as like what you're describing. So yeah, why is it that you want to take this approach?
I think it's more around the topic area, the subject area that we're dealing with, because in health and social care, you never know what's around the corner. In terms of, in a practitioner sense, you might sort of hypothesize that something might happen, but actually you've got to legislate for the thing that you weren't expecting. And I think we need to have that with our students. We need to make sure that they are comfortable, and that we show that we're not only communicating, but they can communicate back to us, and that they feel that there's that element of trust in terms of, well, I'm not comfortable with this, I need to talk to you about it. And it's leading them down towards, for me, it's leading them into this sort of area of concept of self-learning. So going into the andragogical side of things, because you might come from school and it's very much rote learning. You do this, you learn about X, and then you learn about Y, and then you put X and Y together and you get whatever it might be. Whereas this is about really reflecting on what it is that you as a learner need to know, and what you as a learner need to know with regard to your intended practice or your current practice. And only you really know that. I can't legislate that students in class all need to know about, I don't know, negligence, for example. They do, but there might be something that you think, well, actually that's out of the bounds of my particular professional sphere, but actually it's something that I need to learn about, because it might be something in the longer term as a student that I might decide that I want to do. I mean, an example of that would be students who come onto our programme thinking they might want to be a social worker. And they have, because we do have mandatory placements, so they do placements. And obviously we talk a lot about sort of practice, multidisciplinary practice, etc., etc. And the number of students that actually by the end of the programme think they want to do something else. They actually, I didn't realise there was such a wide world out there in terms of the different roles. And I think it's about preparing our students for the reality of practice. And a lot of health and social care practice has moved away from the traditional roles like social workers, OTs, physios, those things. Although those roles are still important, and many of our students do go on to do graduate entry programs, but there are other roles out there that our students can embrace and make their own. A good example of that is social prescribing. So I've got a student at the moment who is working within the social prescribing team. It's a very different concept because it's all around the holistic nature of care, which centers around the patient or the client, and everything around that. So it's not around the clinical necessarily, although clinical obviously has to come into it. It's about those social elements in terms of getting people to re-engage with society and to look at their needs. So what is it that you need from me rather than I think you need this? So it's a very different approach.
Okay, so what would you say as the biggest challenge for you when it comes to your teaching?
The biggest challenge is being as contemporary as possible. Okay. We get over that particular challenge by having the most amazing network of agencies and sectors who want to come and talk to our students. I feel quite privileged that we have so many people who want to come and talk to our students. And that's part of advocating what their roles are, but also about sharing their own learning. You tend to find that people in health and social care always want to share. This is my story. So what's your story? So can we sort of marry that together and see where we can move practice forward? And I think, we are extremely privileged at this particular institution and on the courses that we've got that practitioners want to come and talk to us about that, and having that connectivity is also the connectivity around placements as well, in terms of giving people a real life experience of what goes on out there, and the changes that happen all the time. Because as you know, health and social care changes by the month, and obviously if we're coming towards a political change, there might be another change. So that again, it's not a massive challenge, but it is a challenge to make sure that we're aware of all the changes in practice and what might influence, the direction of travel with regard to practice.
Okay, so how important is theory but obviously practice or the reality and the fast changing nature of the sector is such a prominent thing. So when it comes to you guys, teaching the students theories, how relevant is it in practice?
So evidence-based practice forms, our curriculum, it has a spiral curriculum, okay? And that spiral, one of the spirals is evidence-based practice. And evidence-based practice changes from minute to minute, hour to hour, based on, how quickly things manage to get published. So one of the things we always say to students is, rather than go trotting off to the library to look for textbook, go online, because there's so much online. We teach evidence-based practice from year one right the way through, even into master's level. So, evidence-based practice at year one will be something around, critical inquiry, looking at how to read evidence, how relevant evidence is in practice. We use various tools for them to be able to critically analyse papers and to get used to reading research, and all sorts of research. So, across the spectrum. And then we sort of thread that through into their research modules to enable them to actually feel comfortable and confident in terms of not only being able to read the research, apply the research, but also do the research. And that for me is really important, because the way we change the world is by evaluating and critically evaluating, and then by doing some primary research if we get the opportunity to do that.
Earlier you mentioned andragogy. So I'm just wondering what your perception is in terms of the difference between andragogy and heutagogy.
Okay, so andragogy is about that person-centered learning, but with some direction from teacher. Okay, I say teacher, maybe that's not the right word, but from facilitator. I mean, I've always said that when I'm in class, I'm the facilitator of learning, but sometimes you've got to hold that back. There are times when you do need to pare it back and be able to make sense of what's driving the student's inquiring mind. Whereas heutagogy, the theory says that is completely led by the learner. But in clinical practice, as in teaching practice, there are certain things you have to do. There are certain things you have to know. You have to know about safeguarding, for example, and that would cover both teaching and health and social care. You've got to know the principles behind that. So there's a bit of a juxtaposition between the two. I think less so in a higher education environment with regard to the hertagogy, because I think that's more around self-directed learners whilst people are in practice and looking at continuous professional development, whereas andragogy, there's that little bit of facilitation and the steerage. It's almost like you're a satellite navigation system driving people towards a certain goal, but allowing them to do it in a way that they learn best. And our learners do have very diverse needs, and it's very much about their learning styles, them understanding their learning styles, and then being able to adopt a style that sort of enables them to effectively learn. One of the things that we do in the first year is we do a piece of work around evidence-based practice, where they look at a topic that they really are interested in. So they do a search and a critical analysis. The second part of that is they do an action plan about their own learning. So what did I do? What did I do well? What did I do not so well? What can I learn from this? And that makes them, or helps them, identify their own learning style. And some need more direction than others, and part of that remit is about saying, well, I will go now to my tutor and say, I need support looking at this and this. I need a little bit more direction. Whereas I feel, somebody else might say, well, I'm perfectly happy, I've done various things and I'm quite happy to go off and direct my own learning.
So would you say like your approach would have both of those?
Yeah, I think it's something around having that flexibility and using your intuitive practice to know where they perhaps sit within individual learners.
Which one do you think is more prominent overall in your practice?
I think in health and social care, because we are preparing the students for sort of a career in the sector, it's more andragogy at this point, although I would facilitate them or sort of encourage them to go on to the hertagogy later on in terms of thinking about their own learning. And certainly some work I've done around clinical isolation directs, practitioners need to direct themselves, because there's a lack of sort of national direction around what people need to learn around continuous professional development, depending on the role that they're in. So I think it's something that maybe hasn't been appreciated by the sector until we need to sort of embrace that. I think we're quite good at telling people what they need to learn rather than asking people what they need to learn, in order to fulfill their roles. I know I sort of skipped around a little bit, but I think our health and social care students need to have confidence to know that they can ask. They can reflect on what it is that they need to learn, rather than being told they've got to learn X, Y, and Z.
But with all the regulations and I suppose like sort of expectations, professional expectations when you get into the workplace, would there be some kind of expectation, I guess, from the sector to for you to have passed on certain knowledge that you would have to basically teach them?
Yeah, I mean, things like safeguarding, for example, are a prime example. I mean, the expectation would be that they are aware of the role of regulatory bodies. So those sort of things are quite sort of mandated. Each sector, because the sectors run, the agencies in sector run differently, they might have specific requirements around mandatory training that they have for their environment. We tend not to do that, although we do things like prevent and, like I say, safeguarding, in terms of sort of mandated delivery. But we try and use case studies and narratives to enable students to sort of think around the subject areas. So in terms of the specifics, it's quite an eclectic mix. And obviously the key thing for us is around making sure we attain the learning objectives within the modules, but also within the direction of travel of the sector. So if there's I mean, for example, when we had the issues with the pandemic, that completely threw everything askew because nobody was expecting that to happen the way it did. We didn't expect the response from sector. We didn't expect all the challenges from sector. So that made us really step back, reflect in terms of what is it that we should be delivering. You know, at that stage, it was all around infection control, use of PPE, very sort of, you know, sort of task skill orientated. Whereas now we can reflect on that and say, you know, what happened, you know, during the pandemic, and what were the issues that some of you experienced in practice, and you know, and try and get some kind of sort of critical review of that.
So if someone was to want to encourage more of this type of self-directed or self-determined way of learning, instead of the more traditional sort of dependent type, what would they need to do in terms of creating the right environment?
I think the key thing is to listen to your learners, but it also, I think our area of practice is quite unique, you know, and I think it's about making sure that I think it's a challenging question, that really, because it's about having that sort of sensitization to what's going on in terms of practice, but also having, you know, if something came along that needed to be, I don't know, the government decide to vaccinate everybody against shingles, for example, and there's a big, massive, you know, sort of push at that at the moment, then that might be something we pick up within the classroom setting, because it's quite a, you know, sort of rote thing to be talking about. There might be something happen, you know, with regard to a change in policy. So we'd look at that in terms of, but it's about, I think, keeping your ear to the ground and making sure that you are as contemporary as you can be, but also working with your practitioners out there. Because we do rely on them, you know, when they come in and talk in class about their sort of roles, and we pick up, we learn all the time. And that, I think, for me, that's one of the beauties of the course, that we're learning from the practitioners as well. And they might mention, you know, Service X has just developed, and so you go and have a look at that. There might be a change in organisational structure in terms of care delivery, so you go and have a look at that. So it's about keeping that, you know, that open agenda, as it were, in terms of sort of making sure students can experience as much as they can. I mean, we always say we don't teach health and social care, we facilitate the learning of people within health and social care, and get them to challenge practice.
Do you have to prepare the students to become more independent? And if so, how do you do that?
That possibly is one of the other massive challenges. So, you know, in terms of becoming an independent learner, and again, you know, I talked about this spiral curriculum. The independent learner is one of those threads within the spiral. So it's about them, like I said earlier, mentioning about them sort of acknowledging and recognizing their own learning styles, which might be different to the person that you sat next to, but actually you've got a wealth of experience. So how does that experience then translate into your academic world, but also in terms of your assessments, how you contribute in class, you know. And I think we talk about reflection a lot, and we can pay lip service to what people think reflection is, but I think that is one of the key things about people, you know, students particularly, feeling enabled to actually think about themselves. I always use the analogy when we first talk about reflection is what you see in the mirror might not be anything like what other people see, you know, or what you see in the mirror you might not like, and you might want to change that particular reflection or think about it in a different way. And, you know, it's about having permission to think about oneself in a different way. One of the things that I was, we had a group today, which was our senior group, who were teaching the second year students about their dissertations, and their academic reflections and their academic maturity really came through today. Really, you know, they were confident, they were critically reflective of their own work, as well as others' works, but in a very positive way. And that for me, to see that change in an individual over 3 or 4 years, depending on which program they're on, is, that means we've achieved our goal.
So it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I was going to ask you, what is reflection and what does it mean to be a reflective practitioner in the health and social care sector?
Okay. It's affording yourself the opportunity to stand back. I mean, I don't think there's any one definition, and reflection. I remember reflection coming to the fore when I was a student nurse back in 91. It's very much an American concept in terms of reflecting on and in practice. So people like Kolb and Gibbs and Johns and all those theorists. And I always say to students that we might talk to you about different models of reflection, but you've got to find one that suits you, because we are all different. And you might take one element of one model, you might take an element of another model, or just create your own model of reflection. But it's about you. Yeah, because what we see is what we reflect on, and what we can then sort of evaluate in terms of how we move our individual practice forward. So I say we've got oodles of models out there to choose from, and we're never prescriptive with students in terms of making a choice, but we actually say, if you want to create your own, do. And it's about you thinking about you, which can be very challenging for a lot of people, to be self-reflective. And actually, if you reflect and think, well, actually, I don't like what I see, how do I manage that? Then we've got to make sure we've got things in place to support students with that, and how we can take that through positively. And that helps them with their sort of independent learning. So who am I? What am I? Where am I going? What have I done? What's my past experience told me?
So how would somebody overcome that kind of unknown situation where you don't really know what when you're reflecting, we can only reflect based on what we know, and so that we can interpret in a particular way. But then when it comes to situation where maybe it's a new scenario that I've never come across before, and in order to reflect on it, it's going to be quite challenging to kind of get some valuable insight from that situation, unless you know all the things that you need to know.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's not always about solving the problem. It's often looking at the problem before you even consider solving it. So okay, I know a lot of practices around solving a problem, putting something into action. What we try and get the students is to stand back and look at what they see the problem is, and we've all had some experience, none of us are blank sheets, are we? So we've had some experience of life, and perspective, whether it be an educational perspective, whether it be a community perspective, a cultural perspective. We've all got a perspective on whatever we see in front of us, and we always say to the students, don't jump in and try and solve the problem. Just think about what it is that you're looking at, and talk about it with your colleagues in the room, and see what they think. And it's about listening to different sort of responses and different views on how, and it might be that somebody's been in a situation or come across a situation that then feeds that knowledge to those that perhaps haven't. So it's moving from the sort of hypothetical to the, well, this happened to me actually, or I was in a practice scenario and this is what we did at the time, but after the scenario we reflected on that, and we thought we probably could have done things better. And for me, it's around not looking to solve the problem, but to consider the problem, or an issue. Let's say problem, because that makes it very negative, but some kind of scenario in practice.
Okay, so what's the most important thing when it comes to critical reflection? So when it comes to that criticality that we're talking about, what would be the one most important thing that people have to sort of consider when they try to critically reflect?
I think it depends on where you are as an individual in terms of your life course. I think, if you've been a practitioner for a number of years, you might go with your intuitive practice side of things. If you're somebody who has more limited experience, you might sort of try and look, or it might be around that sort of, well, what do I know? What do I not know? well, you never know what you don't know, but you know, how is it that I can find knowledge to inform me? You know, that's equally so if you're looking at your sort of intuitive practice, but and that's where the evidence-based practice can come in. So I think there's a marriage there between intuitive practice, past experience, lived experience, and looking at evidence. So I don't think there's one thing. I think it has to be a multitude of things that come to be reflected upon and considered.
So you talked about, you literally just mentioned about evidence-based practice. How important is practitioner research?
Oh, for me, incredibly important. You know, I come from a nursing background, and nursing research really took off, certainly when I was at Nottingham, so that was 2006. You know, nursing research was really starting to, you know, the trajectory is really, you know, starting to elevate. Nursing research in the US has been around for many, many years, and they are ahead of us when it comes to sort of some of the more sort of robust nursing theories that have been used in practice. But nursing research in this country has really, you know, really taken off. Practitioner research, again, I think one of the key things around practitioner research is the fact that it's having time. I know there are so many people out there who, you know, they'll come to you with an idea, but and say, well, or not you, but they'll come with an idea, but actually don't know how to then progress that in terms of the hoops that you have to jump through in terms of whether it be evaluative research or service evaluation, because A, they don't know the mechanisms, and B, they haven't got time because they're busy practitioners. And I've always been of the mindset that, you know, research is open to everybody. You know, I used to say to the students, don't be scared of the word research. It is just, you know, a word that is used for you to start thinking about how you're going to enhance practice, about things that you can do in terms of evaluating practice. Practitioner research particularly, and I am a little bit biased because I'm a qualitative researcher, particularly around qualitative, has started to become very on trend, as it were. And it's very much that interpretive, tell me about your experience, you know, listening to the individual. You know, I mean, all research is valuable, but particularly when it comes down to thinking about person-centered holistic care, the only person who can tell you about that is the person who has undergone a particular experience. So certainly on our course, the research is, for me, the backbone of the programme, or all programmes, whether it be the undergrad or the masters. And it's about giving people the knowledge and the skills, but more importantly, the confidence to go out there and take a piece of research. And that research then, okay, yes, we're using it as an academic qualification, for me, has to have credibility in the sense that how are we then going to look at changing practice? You know, whether it be the research going into publication or going to a conference, or you know, getting the message into practice. So it might be that somebody's done a piece of research, and practitioners actually think, well, I didn't think about it in that particular way. This is really important. So it's this sort of, you know, this two-way street between the fact that, you know, my students do have time to do primary research, but actually, how do we then get that into practice and support practitioners to consider or think about changes?
But for practitioners, how important is it that they actually carry out research themselves, as opposed to engaging with research out there that someone else has carried out? Just because, like, obviously you mentioned earlier, or alluded to at least, that time is lacking. And, you know, similar in education, where, you know, you get teachers in different settings who are really struggling with time. And so how would you overcome that challenge of, you know, being able to do the research, which is see valuable, but at the same time, like, well, when do I do it?
That's a big question. I guess I know the recognition of the importance of research comes across all of our regulatory bodies. But I know locally there is a big move towards getting practitioners to think differently about research in terms of, yes, you can do it. It doesn't have to be part of an educational course. You know, it could be a quick evaluation around, I don't know, patient's experience of a particular, you know, service. It's about for me, it's about building it into our everyday lives. The other issue about that is that we do, as practitioners, we do research all the time, even though we don't think about it, because every time you talk to a client or a patient or collect data, whether it be do a blood pressure or whatever it might be, that's data, you know, and that can inform practice. So it's looking at, for me, in a sense, it's looking at at smart ways of using that data that we collect on an everyday basis, and how we can sort of critically reflect on that and then use that in terms of informing our practice. So it might not be, you know, a full-scale research project that, you know, is fit for academic publication. It's about recognizing that what you do every day actually is research, and it's really valuable. Every time you have a conversation with a patient or client, you know, even though you're not formally using that, that actually informs your own evidence base, doesn't it, in terms of your own practice. So we sort of come back full circle, haven't we? You know, we might not be doing, you know, that sort of high profile academic research, but actually we're doing our own research, which then informs a practice that helps us with critical reflection, and then that helps with the intuitive practice side of things. So
yeah, so if it's already kind of like an intuitive sort of approach anyway, which a lot of people probably already doing as their, you know, day-to-day job, how important is it to make it into something more conscious? You know, like, as in, what kind of benefits would you be looking at if you were to make it more conscious, of a conscious process? Because what I'm just trying to get at really is just the motivation of doing research consciously. You know, if I'm already doing these things and I can be intuitive about my practice, then it's almost like, well, why would I then try to spend more time thinking about it in a more systematic way to make it into like proper research, if you like?
I think the key thing there is about letting everybody know it's doable. So you can, you know, you can engage in the process, and it's not that sort of scary thing that's sort of over on the other side of the, you know, over on the other side of the room that we can't engage with, and that you know, part and parcel of everyday practice. And I think it's a challenge, because I know clinicians are so busy, you know, and I think one of the key things is about, you know, the regulatory bodies put that as one of the sort of cornerstones of their, you know, requirements around your code of practice. But it's also about how we facilitate that through leadership and, you know, organisational culture, because we talk about learning cultures, and I think in an effective learning culture, it becomes second nature. You know, one of the things that I always remember when I was at University of Nottingham was we were always, when we're sort of reflecting on our teaching and learning, and sort of reflecting with students, is, okay, so that's really good, and we've done, you know, whatever it might be. So how do we actually get our message out there? What is it that we need to do now to convince others that they can do it too? And that actually it doesn't require an extraordinary amount of time. It's just part and parcel of our everyday sort of practice. And it was very much the mindset that, you know, you did that as part of your, and we encouraged our sort of nurses of the future to do that as well. You know, this is part and parcel of what you need to do. There are formal mechanisms that, you know, need to be looked at in terms of education, and I think educational courses now are so much more in tune with evidence-based practice and looking at practitioner research, and that can only be a good thing. And that's across the board, whether you're thinking about nursing, health and social care particularly. You know, there's not that really strong culture of research. I think we need to build that in, and that's where I think our courses come in, and the students go, yeah, we can do that. And as a practitioner, I know I can do that, and I can encourage others to do that. So it's having the skills and having the confidence to make it doable.
How do you create that kind of culture, though, in terms of like, for people to, want to embrace, research, for example, and basically what I'm trying to ask really is about the leadership or effective leadership of that kind of institutional learning or research culture that you see beneficial. But for somebody, for example, one of your students doing your master's program, what would you say to them in terms of like how they could lead and reculture somewhere so that it is more suitable for that sort of environment that you're describing?
It does come down to considering sort of what the culture is in the organisation, and I think also it's around sort of those skills in terms of some of the leadership acceptance in terms of where we go, and how enabling we make, how making us enablers of other individuals, and it's also about having, it's the value side of things, isn't it? It's about, okay, so we're organisation X and we want to look at whatever it might be, and who have we got within that organisation that might champion that, but you've got to have everybody else on board as well. So it's about sort of it's about having a culture that is dynamic, a culture that encourages leadership, not just in a managerial perspective, but leadership from all and with all, and valuing everybody's attributes. And I think culture is always the hardest thing to change in an organisation. But if you've got people who you can carry with you, you're on the same trajectory, then the cultural shift will be different. More will be easier. Whereas if you've got people who don't see the benefit or the value, then that sort of cultural shift will be very difficult to sort of implement.
So when it comes to disseminating research, now from my own experience, and this is just from my own experience, I feel like having research disseminated properly or on a wider scale, it is probably one of the biggest challenges. I wonder if it's similar in the healthcare sector.
Yes. I always describe dissemination of evidence as being more like trying to throw a bird than a stone. So if you try and throw depending on how good your aim is, if you try and throw a rock or a stone, you more or less know where it's going to land. Whereas in the healthcare practice, and this comes from a piece of work that was done back in the 90s by Ryson and I can't remember the names of the two theorists, but they came up with this idea that if you throw a stone, you sort of know where it's going to land, whereas if you throw a bird, it'll sort of flap all over the place and it won't land in the right place. So that's one of the things, one of the key challenges with this dissemination of evidence into healthcare practice, whether it be healthcare, social care, any of those sort of allied healthcare areas, is that you don't know where your research is going to land. And I think one of the key challenges we have is, things are published, but they might be published in very sort of specialist journals, so people don't always have access, or clinicians don't always have access to those particular publications. And I think that is in part when we come into sort of a classroom environment where we're talking to students about evidence, about sort of scoping for evidence, looking for the breadth of different subject areas that they're interested in, and considering why a particular topic might be published in a particular journal and how that might influence practice. And of course, we'll come back to the old thing around time and having time to sort of read journals, having the skills and confidence to be able to critically review journals. I think today's the fact that we've got so many different social media sites, I think they've helped. I think some of the, when you think to, sites like LinkedIn and, even Facebook, they can direct, individuals to certain elements of evidence or practice that is good practice. And then if people want to, follow those up in terms of their own learning, they can do that. And that's where we try and develop these autonomous learners, these independent learners. But people haven't, again, it's about a time thing. I did a piece of research way back when that looked at dissemination of evidence into a practice setting. And the key thing that came up was time. That, I would love to have time to read, but, I'm so busy. End of the day, I'm so tired. I might pick up a journal and fall asleep by the time I've got to, the sort of past the abstract, those sort of things. But also having, I think one of the other things is around having forums, not just sort of formal education forums. And this is a piece of work that we did a little while ago around general practice, where nurses and clinicians from whatever agency can come together and talk about practice. Because that in itself is about that voyage of discovery and understanding, what's gone on in a practice situation, but critically reflecting and then thinking about, well, if people are interested, to go off and find some evidence about how we can improve things. And, I think it goes back to that learning culture, doesn't it? So we sort of come back full circle, and having that sort of impetus, to maintain your learning and to constantly want to improve practice.
It's almost like having, well, I suppose it is having professional learning communities, right? And I suppose like it can be seen as one of the ways that you can overcome the challenge of not having time, because like if you were doing action research yourself, so obviously then you would be able to have some insight or evidence that you can offer other people, and other people can do the same for you. And so then rather than having to read this journal paper, you could probably just do it in practice, or you can do it yourself as well.
Put together as a collective. So maybe there's something there about collective learning. I mean, we talk about collective leadership, which is about sort of, the hierarchical thing, sort of, being there, but it's not there. So people come together and collectively lead and know their roles. But maybe there's something around this collective learning that practitioners need to do, and particularly practitioners who may be more isolated. So we do, people who might be working in patients' homes, or, sort of out of a big organisation, can feel clinically isolated when it comes to their learning. And I think that's something we need to recognise, and how we get them to think about their sort of day-to-day practice and what they require in terms of their learning. And I know, various sort of organisations, small organisations around here who do that. They come together as a collective and talk about particular things, and sort of share that experience. So I think that should be part and parcel of that organisation and that culture around learning.
Brilliant. Well, it's been absolutely amazing speaking with you. Learned a lot. I just wonder if we could perhaps finish on the question of, if you have to give one piece of advice for education practitioners regarding professional learning that they can learn from the healthcare sector, what would it be?
Gosh. Listen to yourself.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.